As the Vikings traveled through Ireland, they encountered a group of people who were even more savage than the others they had previously encountered. These individuals had tattooed bodies and a demeanor that left the Vikings absolutely astonished. Despite the contrast between the land and the people, the Magnus brothers and Atla's sons continued to trade and wreak havoc throughout Ireland and the British Isles, to great success. They managed to take plenty of booty, and lost only a few men thanks to Hafnarfjordr's wise leadership and vigilant foresight. Hafnarfjordr had often employed a successful stratagem, sending Hardanger and Hjörungavag out on a foray with the two smallest ships, while the rest of the fleet distracted the land defenders elsewhere. These two Viking brothers enjoyed these excursions and always brought the best men with them. With these soldiers at their side, they were typically successful in their expeditions and were able to bring back rich booty. However, one time they nearly met their match. A fleet of 5 Swedish Viking ships came upon them as they were rowing out of a bay. The Swedes believed they could make use of both the ships and any treasures on board, so they set after the Vikings with their battle flag raised. Hardanger and Hjörungavag were forced to accept battle against a superior enemy force and made the decision not to surrender. But before the battle could begin, the rest of the Viking ships appeared on the horizon, having come to see what had become of their brothers. The Swedes, realizing they were outnumbered by the now larger Viking fleet, made a hasty escape into a nearby fog bank. As the summer began to draw to a close, the Vikings had sold all they had brought with them from home, and were ready to return, as they were already well provided with foreign goods. The sea stirred from its summer slumber, a fact made plain by the ship's movements. The waves were already aware of winter's imminent approach. The warships were heavily laden, suited for combat rather than autumn voyages. Yet the Vikings set sail homeward, tracing the same path they had come, beneath the colourless skies of late summer by day and the clear golden stars by night. They were propelled by prosperous winds, reaching Norway as the leaves began to fall. During the voyage home, Hardanger longed for Astrid. He counted the days, unable to sleep. It seemed to him that Astrid had been close to him during the summer. Absence and separation had intimately united them. However, his longing was mixed with fear, though it lacked discernible form or substance. Upon arriving at Hisargavel, Atla's sons bid Harold and Hardanger farewell. The companions thanked one another for their time together, making plans to reunite the following summer. They drank to each other's health and swore eternal friendship from glass goblets filled with dark wine. Harold and Hardanger, in turn, invited Atla's sons to a feast on the first day of Geiranger, bringing as large a retinue as they desired, an offer which they accepted. In a state of inebriation, Hjörungavag mentioned Astrid's name. Hardanger perked up, listening to Hjörungavag's rambling. He could not make sense of Hjörungavag's words, but he discovered that Astrid was on his mind. That evening, Hardanger threw a spear overboard. The Sir Magnus brothers and Atla's sons said their farewells, each sailing home with rich booty in tow. Chapter 4. Astrid awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of oars slicing through the water in the fjord. She hastily dressed and made her way down to the landing place. The full moon was obscured by ominous clouds, shrouding everything in an eerie darkness. The ships on the fjord's black surface appeared ghostly and ominous. Fear gripped Astrid's heart as the ships rode silently in the stillness of the night. The lone sound of the oars striking the water echoed eerily. Was Hardanger among them? She counted the ships and realized they were not all there, but the larger shadows on the fjord could be obscuring the smaller ships. She strained her eyes to make out the ship's characteristics, but the darkness which blanketed everything made it difficult. Should she just go back home and forget about the ships? What if she never saw Hardanger again? She could not bear the thought. She stayed rooted in place as the foremost ship rode into the broken moonlight's view, and she thought she could recognize Hardanger's dragon. She ran down to the water's edge, squinting her eyes until they ached, and focused intently on the shadows of the approaching ship. The ship's dark outline made it almost impossible to distinguish its color or shape. It glided steadily towards her, looking more like a shadow than a vessel, but there was no denying the silvery drops of water that glistened off the oar blades. Suddenly a rift in the clouds allowed the moon's pale light to illuminate the shoreline, and Astrid stood there, captivated. Could Hardanger be among them? The thought of his return was almost too much for her to comprehend. Yet still, there would come a time when his ship would return without him, or his people would arrive, carrying his lifeless body on a bier, blood-stained from winter battles. The realization of his mortality made her heart feel heavy. There would be a time when Hardanger was no more, and she would have to find a way to go on living. Astrid breathed in the moon's wan light, feeling like it was her last breath. She embraced Hardanger with her soul, refusing to let him go, even in death. As the ships moved closer, she retreated into the shadow cast by one of the nearby boathouses. She needed to confirm if Hardanger was with them before she made any mistakes. She longed to walk beside him, away from prying eyes. She wanted him all to herself now that she had him back after a seemingly endless summer. Hardanger obliged, forgetting everything else but the fact that she was with him again. They walked together in comfortable silence, exchanging only brief questions and answers. They didn't need much talk between them. They had each other. Meanwhile, excitement overflowed in the house. Men and women chattered, kissed, and glanced at each other with joy and embarrassment. Children of all ages hopped, sang, and brawled with each other in private little wars. Men carried goods from the ships to the house, then strolled back and forth in groups, chatting vigorously. Harold watched them as they worked. He made sure that everything got done, unloading the ships and carrying the goods to the house. It was best to do it soon, as the weather and sea this time of year were unpredictable. Harold felt happy and confident being home again. He eased the strict discipline he usually maintained over the work, and gave each man enough time to greet friends and talk confidentially. If any man didn't work willingly, Harold called him by name in a friendly way and nudged him into action. But that was hardly necessary. The men were eager to get the job done. Harold had promised them a few days' respite when the goods were in the house and the ships in the sheds. Magnus finally emerged, aged and bowed, blinking through inflamed eyes in the harsh light. He yawned so widely that his jaw cracked and shook, the chill autumn air gnawing at his flesh. Old age had overtaken him, hunching his back and gnawing at his limbs. Harold's eyes locked onto his father's figure as he hastened towards him. It had been several months since he had seen him last, and the realization of how old and frail his father had become hit him hard. A strong feeling of sympathy coursed through him, and he whispered something into a man's ear as he passed him. The man smiled and nodded before running down to the ships. Harold quickly approached his father, greeting him with reverence and tenderness. The old man was guarded, mistrusting of others due to his advanced age. He was peevish and gruff, greeting his son nonchalantly before delving into practical matters. Did Harold have all the ships with him? Had he allowed himself to be cheated? Had he brought home an Irish wife? How many men had fallen? Did he have anything worthwhile to report? Harold's voice sounded high-pitched and strident, and he found himself having to repeat his answers to his father's repeated questions. He suddenly realized that his father's hearing had deteriorated, and he had to raise his voice to be heard. Magnus, noticing the change, yelled out that his hearing was worse, and Gunnar had even gone blind. Magnus laughed at the situation, but it left Harold feeling uneasy. Suddenly Magnus stopped mid-laugh and gazed down towards the ships. His eyes widened as he began to count and point with a crooked finger. Harold watched in confusion as his father counted up to 20 before breaking off and asking him how many ships there were altogether. Harold smiled, responding in a friendly tone that there were many ships, and that he made sure his father had plenty of wine. Men trundled their barrels up the hill towards the house, each step bringing forth a sloshing of red wine from the land of the Franks. And like a spirit called forth by the scent of the wine, Gunnar appeared from the house, held up by 2 sticks, his legs feeling their way forward with trepidation. Magnus spotted him and shouted in excitement, his voice high and unrestrained. "Now the barrels of red wine from the land of the Franks are coming in a long line rolling up to the house, cousin Gunnar," he exclaimed. Gunnar, his voice trembling and weak, replied, "Ah, my eyes. Gladly would I have seen that sight, but keep silent, so that I can, at any rate, hear the wine slopping inside the barrels." A restlessness stirred in Magnus's blood, his fingers tightly latching onto Harold's cloak, drawing him closer for a quick kiss on the forehead. With stiff legs, Magnus clambered over to Gunnar, clapping him on the shoulder in solidarity. "I cannot hear, and you cannot see, cousin. But let us thank Sigfather that we can both still taste. Isn't your tongue dry knowing that there is so much wine close by? Mine rolls in my mouth like birch bark." In no time at all, the 2 elder kinsmen were seated side by side in the high seat, savouring the first taste of the prized red wine. Noisy slurps and satisfied tasting filled the room. Magnus asked between gulps, "How do you like it?" Gunnar replied hastily, "It tastes good, but I miss seeing the colour." "Splash a little in your eyes, cousin," Magnus suggested teasingly, a laugh escaping him. As the day wore on, the two kinsmen grew increasingly merry, succumbing to the wine's enticing spell. By the time the sun lowered itself below the horizon, their snores echoed loudly throughout Drammen, the drink having well and truly taken hold. It wasn't until evening that Harold finally discovered Hardanger and Astrid. Wrapping his arms around his sister, he delivered a tender kiss. "Are you pleased with all the gifts, sister?" he asked, a smile brightening his face. Astrid's gaze darted between him and Hardanger, her eyes widening with each passing moment. A smile tipped the corners of her mouth, though it was clear she didn't quite understand what was happening. Hardanger, on the other hand, looked crestfallen, his discomfort plain on his face. "I completely forgot," he admitted, stumbling over his words as he blushed furiously. Harold let out a thunderous laugh, but Astrid paid him no mind, instead wrapping her arms around Hardanger's neck and planting a tender kiss on his lips. Her brother's eyes lingered on them, but she paid him no mind. Chapter 5. Olmod the Old, son of Hordakare and a kinsman of Hardanger, was a notable Scandinavian warrior. He was admired by all, known for his wisdom, shrewdness, and combat readiness. At drinking halls, he was revered as a hero who always emptied the bottles. His comrades had no idea that underneath his unshakable facade lay a great sense of restlessness. As talkative as he was, Olmod was not one for opening up, and though he was friendly with everyone, he never bared his soul to anyone. He had a way of making people think they knew him, yet no one did. Olmod was a restless traveller, spending his summers on Viking expeditions and winters as a guest in different places. He had many friends, and his mere presence brought joy to any gathering. Among his kinsmen, Hardanger was his favourite. Like Olmod, Hardanger was a man of few words, and this appeared to have bonded them. However, Hardanger had no inkling of how fondly Olmod thought of him. Olmod never talked to him or gave him gifts, leaving him in the dark about how he felt. But Olmod was keeping a close eye on his kinsman and was privy to all his affairs. The previous summer, Hardanger and his friend Harold had gone on a Viking expedition with Atla's sons. When Olmod visited Atle Knud at Gudvangen that winter, he could not resist spending time with his host's sons. While there, he overheard a conversation between Hedmark and Hjörungavag, which was not meant for his ears. They discussed the rumour that Astrid and Hardanger had feelings for each other. Hedmark asserted that women's tastes were unpredictable, adding that, at Hisargavel, he noticed Hardanger throw a spear overboard. Hjörungavag reacted with displeasure, saying that he would not give Hardanger any reason to dispose of more of his weapons. Rather, he wanted to ensure that Hardanger had opportunities to use them all. Needless to say, Olmod had a lot to reflect on after hearing this conversation. Olmod had heard enough of Hardanger's friends. He left soon after overhearing their conversation and made his way towards Magnus's house, where he was warmly greeted by Magnus and his brothers. After spending a week there, he decided to continue on his journey, but not before having a confidential talk with Harold. "I hope you don't mind me interfering in your affairs, Harold," Olmod began, "but as an old man I tend to get talkative. I just want to remind you that Atla's powerful sons, whom you and Hardanger have invited to the winter feast, should be shown all possible honour. It would be advisable to invite as many of your kinsfolk and friends as possible to the feast." Harold remained silent and looked intently at Olmod, who met his gaze with a quiet and experienced smile. Harold realized that Olmod was more than just a guest. "You come from Gudvangen," Harold said thoughtfully in a low voice. "Is that your advice?" "That is my advice," Olmod replied firmly. "And remember, Hafnarfjordur is only one of Atla's sons." Harold asked if Olmod had discussed this with Hardanger, but the old man simply replied, "I know my kinsman, Hardanger, and I know you too, Harold." Before leaving, Olmod received some handsome gifts from Harold and was escorted part of the way on his journey. Then, on the first day of the month of Geiranger, Atla's sons arrived with a large entourage at Magnus's house. Harold had followed Olmod's advice and invited a large circle of friends and kinsfolk to the feast for Atla's sons. When Hafnarfjordur saw how many were invited, he smiled and said, "We sons of Atli are not accustomed to receiving our friends with such a great force." Harold looked at him seriously and replied, "One can never show too much honour to one's friends, Hafnarfjordur." Hafnarfjordur felt a shift in the air as the conversation among his brothers turned serious. Something was amiss, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew it was significant. Hedmark and Hjörungavag huddled together, whispering. Hafnarfjordr couldn't help but feel uneasy at the sight of them, and Harold was watching them closely, his eyes darting back and forth. "We've been treated too well," Hedmark said with a sly grin. "There must be a reason behind it." Hjörungavag nodded, and Olmod the Old was here too. His demeanor was different when he left. What could he have told them? Hedmark pondered aloud. Something he overheard, perhaps, Hjörungavag replied dryly. Hafnarfjordr couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding at their conversation. Something was brewing, and he didn't want to be caught off guard. Meanwhile, Magnus was a different man altogether in the presence of guests. He was revitalized and full of life, not just gulping down his wine, but savoring it. He knew how to be a gracious host, filling the room with contagious merriment. Gunnar, on the other hand, preferred to stay in his chambers when guests were around. His blindness made him restless, and he found solace in being left alone with his wine. Magnus beckoned Hafnarfjordr to sit beside him on the high seat, while the other sons of Atle and the Sir Magnus brothers took their places outside. The remaining guests were seated according to their age and status. As the hall filled up, Magnus revelled in the joy of the feast. He spared no expense, ensuring that everyone was well fed and enjoying themselves. For Magnus, there was nothing more satisfying than seeing his guests happy. The flames flickered and danced merrily on the smooth stone of the hearth. The feast had reached its climax, and the bowls and plates had been cleared away to make room for the real revelry. The young and beautiful women of the household moved about in their finest attire, pouring beer for the guests. Among them was Astrid, who served at the high table. Hjörungavag's eyes followed her every move now, watching her with a new-found fervour. He had never been so open about his affection for her before. Astrid couldn't help but notice his unrelenting gaze, and it made her uneasy. She wished she could leave the hall, but she dared not take her eyes off of Hardanger. He sat at the table, his mouth set in a grim line, barely touching his drink. This was not his usual behaviour at a feast, as he usually drank to excess. Astrid tried to catch his eye, but he refused to meet her gaze. She flitted about the room anxiously, doing her best to avoid looking at Hjörungavag, and never once smiling at him as she did with the other guests when handing him his drink. Hjörungavag made a show of ignoring her avoidance, his eyes still burning with the same intensity as before. He rose to his feet when Magnus proposed the toast to the gods, downing his drink with enthusiasm. As the toast to Brage was proposed, he spoke up in a clear voice. "It is customary for high-born men to make a vow when Brage's toast is called," he proclaimed. "I have a vow to make, and I ask you, my dear friends, to bear witness." He looked around the room, catching sight of his brother Hafnarfjordr's warning glance, Hardanger's bowed head, and Harold's stony expression. But his gaze lingered longest on Astrid, who stood with a mixture of uncertainty and fear etched on her face. With a smile, Hjörungavag held up his drink once more. "I vow with Brage's toast that I will marry Astrid, daughter of Magnus or no other woman," he declared loudly. The room fell silent at his words. Astrid stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. She gazed intently at Hardanger, observing as the blood rushed to his cheeks and his fingers quivered. When she realized he had managed to regain control of himself, she quietly slipped out of the hall with a pallid countenance. Hafnarfjordr had risen from his seat when Hjörungavag made his pledge, but then sat down again without a word. Harold kept a smile on his lips, yet his piercing blue eyes betrayed his sharp intellect. Magnus cheerfully reciprocated Hjörungavag, whereas Hedmark chuckled contentedly. Finally Hardanger lifted his gaze. His typically good-natured eyes now conveyed a harsh, antagonistic air. He slowly scanned the room, taking his time to scrutinize each of Atle's sons, and ultimately sending a lingering stare towards his own Magnus brother, Harold, as if he were especially considering him. It was as if he longed for a confrontation with all of them simultaneously, should the need arise. Magnus only received a quick glance, filled with contempt. Hjörungavag comprehended how each of his words had impacted every person his speech concerned. He calmly surveyed the surroundings and resumed with a cheerful note. "Now that I have taken the initiative, it's your turn, friend Harold." Harold made no gesture to stand up. Instead, he redirected his focus towards Hafnarfjordr and spoke in a calm, firm voice that carried across the entire hall. "It would appear Hafnarfjordr is next to carry on the game. He's our leader, and aside from that, the wisest among us all." Hafnarfjordr met his gaze and got up slowly. At first he struggled to find the appropriate words and remained standing silently for some time, looking downwards. An atmosphere of suspense trickled across the room. After he'd found his bearings, Hafnarfjordr spoke in a mournful yet composed voice. "I solemnly vow to judge justly and impartially, should the need for a verdict arise." After his speech, Hafnarfjordr sat down with a sense of melancholy. Jorungavag interjected with a cheerful air, "Your vague commitment doesn't prove you're the wisest among us all. How will you act if you have to pronounce judgment between your friends on one side and your adversaries on the other?" Hafnarfjordr replied sternly and dishearteningly, "That's for me to decide." Harold stood up, his smile replaced by a serious expression. His tone was firm and quiet. "With Braga's toast, I vow to not divide my inheritance with anyone but my brother Magnus, who resides in Hardanger. May all bright gods and good people present hear this." Upon hearing the vow, Magnus rose with some difficulty, suddenly appearing much older. He gave Harold an unfriendly look and left the hall in gloomy silence. Despite this, Hjorungavag remained cheerful and said, "I don't understand that vow," and laughed. Hafnarfjordr responded severely, "It's not difficult to understand. Harold intends to give his sister Astrid to Hardanger and no one else." Hjorungavag laughed incredulously and looked at Hardanger challengingly. Hardanger rose awkwardly and said in a voice that shook with anger and emotion, "I make this vow to show that I am no less formidable than other good men of my race." Hedmark shouted, "That may be an easy vow to keep. Have you forgotten that your grandfather had to leave Telemarken like a criminal?" Hardanger met Harold's gaze and controlled himself. Harold rose slowly, his anger barely concealed. He directed his words to Hafnarfjordr. "When I invited you, Atla's sons, to this feast, I believed that you and my brother Hardanger were sincere friends. From what has happened here this evening and the words spoken, it's clear that I was mistaken, not regarding you, Hafnarfjordr, but your brothers. Hjorungavag's behavior doesn't make me want him as a brother-in-law, even if there were no one else. As for Hedmark, he has insulted my family in this hall. You, Hafnarfjordr, are always welcome here as my guest and friend, but your brothers cannot stay. Only my friends will continue this feast." Hedmark and Hjorungavag had risen from their seats with an air of tension, and Hafnarfjordr followed suit. "I had no part to play in this evening's events, and I couldn't have stopped them," he said somberly. "If I could have, I would have. But now that my brothers are being sent away, I cannot stay here as your guest any longer, Harold. We Atla's sons always stick together." With those words, he and his brothers and their entourage left the hall in silence. No one dared follow them. Harold ordered guards to be stationed on all the roads, anticipating potential further surprises from Atla's sons. But he felt despondent, as the breach with them that he had always feared had finally come to pass. And it had happened in an unexpected way. He had assumed that Hardanger would be the cause, but it turned out to be an indirect consequence. However, Hardanger's self-control had taken Harold aback. He realized that he now had a brother who he could wholeheartedly rely on. He suspected that Hardanger had shown this kind of restraint in the presence of Atla's sons before, but despite this newfound ally, Harold couldn't abandon Atla's sons. He had to stand up for Hardanger against anyone, even Hafnarfjordr if necessary. Surprisingly, as the reality of the breach settled in, Harold didn't feel the crushing loss he had anticipated. He had Hardanger by his side, one competent man who he could depend on. In some sense, Harold felt he had become wealthier. Chapter 6. For many days following the disrupted feast, Magnus kept to himself, his face a cloud of anger. He glared like a raging bull, refusing to acknowledge Harold's presence. Even when Harold attempted to speak to him, Magnus paid him no mind, ignoring him like a gust of wind. Even Gunnar's attempts to talk to his relative fell on deaf ears. To Gunnar, the world seemed unrecognizable. Had Magnus lost his ability to hear? Or perhaps he was now mute. Gunnar eventually gave up, avoiding any sort of confrontation entirely. Instead, he retreated deeper into the darkness of his blindness, drinking himself into a drunken abyss. After days of solitude and furor, Magnus started to tire of his anger. He realized that his wrath was disrupting his intoxication, preventing him from enjoying his wine the way he used to. Taking a new perspective on the situation, he asked for Harold to come to him. "I understand that you refuse to be intimidated by Atla's sons," he began, his tone harsh, yet not unfriendly. "I have thought about the matter and must admit that Jorungavag's proposal was quite bold. He couldn't have known if Astrid was promised to anyone else, and if his intentions would affect our plans. It was wise of you to decline his offer. We, as a race, have the luxury of choosing who our children marry. We do not need to concern ourselves with wedding Knud's sons. I am pleased to see that you are not afraid to show even such people as Atla's sons the rough side of your tongue. Although I once believed that a marriage connection with them would bring honor to our family, I now see that refusing such a connection is just as honorable. It demonstrates that we consider ourselves equal to the Knuds. You are wise, my boy. You may go." Magnus had not spoken so kindly to his son in a long time. Harold, now smiling to himself here and there, felt a great sense of relief. His father's attitude had pained him more than he had been willing to admit. After his conversation with Harold, Magnus went to Gunnar, who was very pleased to observe that Magnus had not lost his ability to speak. A joyous time recommenced for the two relatives, who drank copiously of the red wine and boasted more than ever. They found arrogance in the fact that hostility had arisen between their sons and Atle Knuds, even going so far as to incline to Hardanger and listen willingly to his account of his exploits in last summer's Viking expedition. In their eyes, Hardanger was still a bit of a fool, but nonetheless a man. He had split various heads and saved Hjörungavag's life, as proof that even the worst good-for-nothings could become something if only they had good people to look up to. However, Hardanger cared no more for their praise than he had for their blame. They excused him for this behavior, attributing it to the general lack of respect for the elderly among the youth. As spring approached, Hardanger became very restless and distant. One day he went to inspect his ships in the boathouses. As he did so, he suddenly recollected that during the latter part of the winter, Harold had not bothered himself with goods for the summer's Viking expedition. It was not like Harold to forget something of that sort. Without delay he approached Harold and spoke on the topic. Harold stood and looked attentively at him while he spoke. When he had finished, Harold responded calmly, "It appears to me, cousin Hardanger, that it would be better for us to remain in our house during the summer than to sail out on a Viking expedition. Do you recall the vows that were made here in the winter at the feast we hosted for Atla's sons?" He felt a foreboding that a clash was inevitable if they crossed paths with his brother, but he also didn't want to raise a hand against Hafnarfjordur. The main reason he stayed home, however, was that he didn't trust Hedmark and Hjörungavag anymore. If they both left, there was a chance they would try to take Astrid. His father and Gunnar could easily lose their lives or be subjected to indignities which he would feel obligated to avenge. After reflecting on the situation, Harold spoke. "I can't leave our family and property without someone to oversee them. I won't prevent you from going to Geiranger Fjord since you're set on it, but I worry about you if you go with only 3 ships. I can't spare any more men from home, so you might run into Atla's sons or other hostile Vikings, or you might end up in an unequal battle from lack of foresight. I'd prefer if you stayed home, cousin Hardanger, but if you promise not to engage in an unequal battle, I won't stop you." Without hesitation, Hardanger made the promise. He held out his hand and said, "I promise to be careful. If I encounter danger or a superior force, I'll find a way to escape. Don't worry about me, brother." Harold remembered that Hardanger had kept his word about Atla's sons. He could trust him, even if he made promises hastily and without much thought. As long as Hardanger kept his word, Harold didn't have to be anxious about him. He would be safe enough in a battle that wasn't too unequal, unless the Norns had already destined his demise. The mighty man fought valiantly against the gods and goddesses of fate, but in the end he was left defeated. Accepting his fate, Hardanger began the preparations for his journey. He had amassed a great collection of goods during winter, enough to fill 3 ships. All that remained was to select his crew and ensure the ships were seaworthy. When Hardanger told Astrid he was leaving, she nodded with a brave smile, hiding her true emotions. Astrid knew Hardanger well, and she understood his nature. He was a man who could not be tied down, and she did not want to hold him back. She would suffer in silence for the brief time they would be apart, for separation and longing were a part of the happiness they shared together. One spring day, the wind blew fiercely, and Hardanger set sail with his 3 ships. Standing on the deck, he suddenly realized the pain of parting from Astrid. An old countryman reminded him to keep the salt water outside the ship, and Hardanger smiled wryly, his heart still soft. On the shore, Astrid watched as the striped sails disappeared into the horizon. She was alone, surrounded by the greenery of spring. The trees bloomed anew, and flowers sprouted from the ground, but the absence of Hardanger's warmth left a void in her heart. He was taking the summer away with him, leaving her with nothing but the memories of their love. Astrid gave up looking at the disappearing ships and collapsed onto the soft grass, drained of all energy. She couldn't even find it in herself to cry. She remained there, heart pounding heavily in her chest. The day after Hardanger's departure, Olmod the Old arrived at Magnus's home with his fleet of 5 ships on a Viking expedition. He informed Harold that of Atla's sons, Hafnarfjordur was staying home for the summer. Olmod also mentioned that he had heard Hardanger was venturing to Geirangern alone, and that he had wanted to join him. Upon discovering that Hardanger had already set sail, Olmod hurried to catch up with him. That spring brought young King Hellstorm sailing along the coast, proud locks flowing in the wind. Hellstorm had vowed not to cut his hair until he had conquered all of Norway. He was referred to as Hellstorm Luva by some, and as Hellstorm Harfager by others. Wherever he went, he claimed the land for his own, bringing low kings and chiefs alike. His law was the only law. From the highest noble to the lowliest peasant, everyone paid him tribute. He established district chiefs to enforce his laws, and none dared to defy him. Although some chiefs murmured that Hellstorm was disregarding ancient land rights and flouting the law, he dealt with dissent harshly, killing and confiscating the property of anyone who dared to oppose him. Many of these disgruntled chiefs had no choice but to flee their homeland, travelling to the Faroe Islands, Orkneys, Hjaltland, the Southern Islands, the British Isles, and Ireland. Despite his own stubbornness, Hellstorm would not tolerate obstinacy in others. There could be but one king of Norway, and that ruler was Hellstorm. Chapter 7. Hardanger found himself in a state of serene tranquility as he sailed the seas all alone. There was no one to boss him around or tell him what to do. He relished in his newfound freedom and embraced every moment of it. Each day brought with it its own set of challenges, but he was always up for the task. As he emerged from his cozy sleeping bag, he felt a gnawing hunger deep within his soul and belly. He had a particular destination in mind, the British Isles, and he set his sights on reaching it. Although there was another land to the west that a beggar had mentioned to him once, Hardanger chose not to go there. According to the beggar, the land had no people to trade with or pillage, making it an absurd country. Hardanger was on a mission to trade and engage in Viking expeditions after all. However, if he ever had the time, he would consider visiting the faraway land called Iceland, which the beggar prophesied Hardanger would see one day. But visiting Iceland in the summer meant he would risk spending the winter there, something he couldn't imagine doing without his beloved Astrid by his side. Regardless, he knew that Iceland would always be there, and he could visit it later. For now he revelled in his solitude and the feeling of the sea under his control. Hardanger loved taking command of his ship and feeling the water flow beneath it. He especially enjoyed the feeling of sailing with all of its sails unfurled, slicing through the water and leaving a wake behind. He pushed his ship to the limits of what it could handle, causing even seasoned Vikings to take notice. When he rode the waves right on the brink of destruction, with his grip firm on the trembling tiller, his heart soared in his chest. He felt like a king, commanding the sea with ease. The Vikings watched Hardanger with keen eyes, recognizing a like-minded guide in him. They exchanged nods of admiration when he pushed the limits with his most daring sailing maneuvers. His reckless bravery sparked anticipation within them. They were eager to follow his every wish and command, enchanted by the sharp and pleasant tone of his youthful voice. Surreptitiously, the Vikings sized up Hardanger and wholeheartedly approved of him. Though not as physically powerful as most warriors, it was rare to find someone with such restless eyes. His strength, in hard lumps of muscle in all the right places, was evident when he grasped a man's hand with a grip like an iron claw to greet or thank them. The Vikings sensed that they were in for a summer full of excitement and danger. The thought of some of them heading to Sigfather before the end of the Viking expedition didn't bring them any regret. They didn't mind spending the winter sitting around the golden-bristled boar. Meanwhile, Hardanger had his sights set on proving to Harold that he could flourish in foreign lands on his own, so he proceeded with caution, which wasn't his usual way of doing things, much to the surprise of the Vikings. His shrewd trading practices included purchasing necessary items like salt, wine, and honey. Keeping his promise to Harold, Hardanger avoided engaging in battle. His men were expecting more in terms of plunder, and they were somewhat crestfallen. Hardanger had a small select group of men, and he wasn't interested in fighting an unfair fight. However, to obtain some booty, he orchestrated unexpected attacks with only a handful of his most trusted men. They would row ashore in hidden areas, and if they managed to land undetected, they would proceed stealthily along remote paths and through the thick, dark woods. These missions filled them with immeasurable excitement and pure, unbridled joy. Days and nights could slip away unnoticed for a small force, and even when they did find a suitable place to strike, they had to wait patiently for the right moment. But when the attack finally came, it was overwhelming and unstoppable. Even the seasoned Vikings who had seen many a battle had never experienced such bold and exhilarating raids. Hardanger, their trusted leader, provided them with happiness and purpose in their old age, and there was fierce competition among his men to join him on these forays. Though Hardanger was always careful in choosing his companions, those who were selected felt immensely honored. Throughout the summer, Hardanger and his crew sailed back and forth along the coasts of England and Ireland, avoiding other Viking ships along the way. Though they were often followed, Hardanger didn't want to risk a potential attack, so he made sure to exhibit caution at all times. He slept soundly in his fur sack at night, knowing that fate can be unpredictable. At times he would arrive at a location only to find that Hedmark and Hjörungavag had already been there with their 6 ships, but Hardanger didn't concern himself with trying to catch up to them. He had made a promise to Harold, and he believed that chance would eventually work in his favor. As summer drew to a close, Hardanger headed back home with a sense of disappointment that he had not yet come across Atla's sons. Olmod the Old, a distant relative of Hardanger, had been sailing with a fleet of 5 ships and was constantly asking about his whereabouts. Olmod had followed in Hardanger's wake all summer, but luck seemed to be against him in finding his kinsman. He made offerings and promises to the gods, hoping for their help in his search, but to no avail. Olmod kept himself well informed on the voyage of Atla's sons, but he couldn't decipher whether they meant any harm towards Hardanger. Regardless, Olmod remained vigilant and kept watch. One summer day, Olmod lost track of Hardanger, but soon caught sight of Atla's sons making their way back home. Olmod grew suspicious of their early return and wondered if they were planning an ambush for Hardanger. Olmod, an experienced strategist, decided to keep an eye on them. For a while, Olmod hid his ships in a creek along their route to catch Hardanger. However, he eventually grew impatient and assumed that Hardanger must have taken a different route home. He set course for Norway, believing that it was safest to locate Atla's sons and get some information. If they had sailed directly home, there was not much to fear for Hardanger that autumn. On a dark and stormy autumn day, Hardanger sailed past Hissargavl, thinking he had been deserted by his friends. Suddenly, 6 ships bearing battle ensigns surrounded him. Hardanger counted the ships and realized that they were Atla's sons. Overjoyed to see friendly faces, Hardanger prepared for battle. He was relieved that he wouldn't have to abandon his word to Harold and surrender unconditionally. He called his ships together, ordering the sails to be lowered. With quick efficiency, Hardanger had on board the decks sturdy boards for defense, readying the ships for battle. A look of excitement and anticipation overtook him. The chance to truly engage in battle with Hjörungavag had finally arrived. One of them would surely be a guest of Sigfather by nightfall. The thought of losing 3 ships against the 6 of Atla's sons didn't weigh on Hardanger's mind much. As he gave his commands, his eyes stayed fixed on Hjörungavag's dragon ship. Hjörungavag, too, appeared restless and eager for the conflict ahead. The boat hooks were nearly within arm's reach. "Pull hard, men!" Hardanger wished to greet Hjörungavag. As the first spear soared through the air, both sides reciprocated with exhilarated cries and raucous laughter. Finally, their 2 dragon ships bumped alongside one another, tossing violently atop the grey waters. Angry blows and frantic shouting echoed from each side. Hardanger gruffly shoved his men to the rear, setting his sights on Hjörungavag. A spear just missed Hardanger's ear, and he heard Hjörungavag laugh tauntingly. "You missed one last autumn, but here's another for you." Hardanger dodged to the side, grabbing the spear and throwing it back. "I have enough weapons, Hjörungavag. Soon I'll test the axe you gave me on your own skull." Hjörungavag evaded the spear with a last-second jump to the side. Hardanger now stood near the gunwale, while the battle raged on both sides. The ships violently rocked and crashed together, with salt spray masking the combatants' sweat-soaked faces. Hardanger brandishes his axe high and shakes it at Hjörungavag. "When I cleave your head before long, you will know it wasn't through carelessness. Remember that." Hjörungavag nails him with a derisive laugh. Hardanger's men shield him from proper reach, but Hjörungavag taunts him regardless. "It will double my joy to know you'll soon be lying cold at the bottom of the sea by the side of your spear, while your friend Astrid makes me comfortable." Hardanger charged forward onto the quarter-deck boards, his axe whistling through the air as he swung it high above his head, but his attempts were thwarted by a wall of weapons in front of him. He tried again and again, but each time he was pushed back. Suddenly, one of Atla's son's ships latched onto the other side of the dragon ship. The battle raged on both gunwales. In a brief respite from the chaos, Hardanger took a moment to survey the situation. One of his ships had already fallen, while the other was surrounded by 3 of the enemy's smaller ships. It was clear that his ship was in dire straits. The only question was how long they could hold out. With mounting tension and desperation, Hardanger knew he had to act. He called out to his trusted comrades, warriors who had followed him on daring expeditions before. In a choked voice he urged them forward. "If we are fated for Valhalla, my friends, let us bring Hjörungavag with us, and as many of his men as we can." With renewed vigor, Hardanger charged the gunwale, leading his best men into battle. Despite sustaining a few wounds, he was not afraid of death. He was determined to take Hjörungavag with him. For a moment, all that mattered was the fight in front of him. He struck and thrust, relentlessly pushing forward towards his goal. Even as his warriors fell around him, Hardanger remained undaunted. But suddenly, a fleet of 5 ships came into view, sailing swiftly towards them. Olmod the Old was at the helm, his green cloak billowing in the wind and a golden helmet glinting on his head. He gave no thought to the danger of the battle before him, driving his ships right into the fray. "It seems like you could use a little help, Cousin Hardanger," Olmod shouted out, his battle cry ringing through the air. And with that, the 2 warriors charged forward into the thick of the fight, determined to claim a glorious victory. Hedmark realized quickly that he and his men were in trouble, and quickly gave orders to flee. But their escape was not so easy amidst the chaos of battle. Hjörungavag's ship was now trapped between the ships of Hardanger and Olmod the Old. Hardanger seized the opportunity to attack, taking advantage of the confusion that erupted among Hjörungavag's men as they suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemies. Hardanger managed to get within striking range of Hjörungavag, who calmly prepared to defend himself. But Hardanger was no longer in control. He had become wild and impulsive. In a fit of rage and impatience, he flung his axe at Hjörungavag's face. Despite his best efforts, the blow landed, causing Hjörungavag to drop his weapons and fall to the ground. Hardanger was overjoyed at Hjörungavag's defeat and momentarily let down his guard. One of his men quickly intervened, however, and managed to block an attack meant for Hardanger with a shield just in time. Although the shield was split in 2 by the force of the blow, Hardanger emerged unscathed. He quickly regained his composure and picked up his axe, continuing his assault. With Hjörungavag out of the way, the opposition crumbled soon thereafter. A few of Olmod's ships had managed to recover the vessel that Atla's sons had seized from Hardanger. In exchange for his assistance, Olmod claimed Hjörungavag's ship as his reward, intending to offer it as a sacrifice to Sigfather. The remaining members of Atla's sons' crew scattered, fleeing in all directions. Olmod eventually came across Hardanger nursing his wounds. "You're bleeding quite a bit, cousin," Olmod remarked. "You should be grateful you're bleeding at all." "I have you to thank for that," Hardanger replied, his voice strained. "What brought you here just when I needed you most?" "Perhaps it was Sigfather's hand that led me here," Olmod replied. "I arrived in Drammen the day after you set sail and have been chasing you all summer." Hardanger's eyes widened with fear. "Why were you chasing me?" he asked. "You know why?" Olmod replied pointedly. Hardanger fell silent. "Is that all?" he asked. "Isn't that enough?" Olmod shot back. "Did you really expect me to spend the entire summer following your tedious trail just to deliver a simple message from Astrid?" Hardanger took off his bracelet and presented it to Olmod, showing his willingness to give away all his most precious belongings to his cousin. Olmod warned Hardanger that even though he had defeated the enemies for now, Atla's sons were not to be underestimated, and it might not be safe for Hardanger to return home alone. He suggested that they spend the winter together at Olmod's place, but Hardanger invited Olmod to come with him instead. However, Olmod declined, as he preferred to keep moving and not stay in one place for too long. He reminded Hardanger to be cautious, as there might be more trouble waiting for him in the future, and thanked him for the reward, even though he knew Hardanger was known for being impulsive with his generosity. They bid each other farewell with warm greetings and parted ways towards their own homes. Chapter 8. Harold was taken aback when his brother informed him of the events that had occurred at Hisargavel. He had long anticipated a confrontation between Hardanger and Atla's sons, and his fears had only intensified after the previous winter's feast. He listened intently to Hardanger's tale with a sombre expression. "I have no sorrow for Hjörungavag. he stated gravely once Hardanger had finished. "I am pleased that neither brother survived the game." "It was my blade that felled Hjörungavag," Hardanger replied curtly. "I will not share the glory of the kill with anyone." Harold smiled, but there was no joy in his heart. "The most significant thing, Hardanger, is that you returned home unscathed," he said amicably. "Take pride in your own survival, but let us also thank the gods and fate for their intervention." Astrid was incredibly quiet as Hardanger recounted the battle. Her heart swelled with even more tenderness towards him. Every moment she spent with him was precious. A foreboding feeling within her whispered that Hardanger didn't have much time left. Her happiness felt fleeting, like a flock of birds taking flight. Magnus was thrilled to hear about the conflict at Hissagavel. Harold regaled him with all the details, and at the end of it all, Magnus begged for the story to be told again. It was exactly what he wanted to hear, proof that their lineage was not extinct. He asked for more information and details, nodding in approval every time his brother's name was mentioned. Once his curiosity was satisfied, he sat there contemplatively, still nodding to himself. Gunnar sat in his darkness and endured the entire account in one sitting. When Harold began to repeat the story again, he let out a deep sigh, rose to his feet using his 2 sticks as support, made his way to his chamber and climbed into bed. He couldn't understand why there was still so much chaos in the world. When Harold emerged from his father's chambers, he was pensive and silent. He went in search of Hardanger and found him in Astrid's room. Harold sat down alongside him, utterly quiet for a long while. "Now Hafnar Fjordur has one less arm," he finally spoke up in an almost hushed voice, as if he was merely talking to himself. Astrid glanced hastily towards him. "One would feel a deep yearning for a brother they cherish," she murmured in a calm tone. Hardanger chuckled in a derisive manner. "It won't be a one-armed warrior from Hafnarfjordur who seeks revenge for Hjörungavag," he quipped. Harold locked eyes with him, his gaze pensive but resolute. "I doubt Hafnarfjordur is seeking vengeance," Hardanger sneered magnanimously. Harold rose quietly and declared, "However, it would be wise to remain vigilant against Hedmark." Harold took as many of his own and Hardanger's men as possible back to the chief house, while also gathering up his allies from surrounding areas. He always had a crowd of people around him during the winter months. He stationed guards on all the paths to protect himself from an unexpected onslaught, and then patiently observed the unfolding events. What had occurred already could not be reversed. And whose fault was it? Neither his nor his sweet brother's, Harold mused. He offered sacrifices to Sigfather and Asgard, relying on them and his family's good fortune. Hardanger had to retire to bed as soon as he arrived, a day after battle. For a considerable time he had to remain silent. He suffered greatly from his wounds, which were scattered all over his body, making it nearly impossible for him to rest. Being passive did not come naturally to Hardanger. An insufferable impatience gnawed at him. Repeatedly, just when his wounds were about to heal, they would split again due to his carelessness. The accompanying fever inflicted a debilitating effect on both his body and his mood. He became even bonier and more emaciated than before. Long and wasted, he pondered over the loss of days, which he was undeservedly robbed of. Astrid tended to him diligently and was constantly by his side. That was the sole aspect that helped him come to terms with his current situation. He couldn't look away from her for even a second. Hardanger realized that there was a calming and fulfilling feeling in the sensation of Astrid's hands, which he had not known previously. His mind was consumed with thoughts of battle, and Astrid could see the fire burning in his eyes. She continued to care for him, but it was clear that his restlessness was growing with each passing day. Hardanger would pace around the room with his hands behind his back, muttering to himself about the coming war. Astrid watched him with a mixture of admiration and concern. She had never seen someone so driven before. To soothe his nerves, she began to read to him from one of their favorite books. It was a tale of knights and adventure, and as she spoke, she saw his tension start to ease. He would listen intently, hanging on her every word, and for a few moments he would forget about the outside world. But the respite was short-lived. As soon as she finished reading, he would jump and start talking about the war again. Astrid tried to get him to focus on other things, but nothing seemed to work. It was like he was possessed by the idea of battle. Finally, she decided to seek out Harold for help. It was clear that Hardanger needed something to distract him, and Harold was known for his ability to come up with clever solutions. Harold listened intently as Astrid explained the situation, and then he smiled. He knew just the thing. He went to Hardanger's room and laid out a board game on the table. It was a game that he knew Hardanger loved, and he had brought along a new set of board pieces to make it extra exciting. Hardanger was skeptical at first, but as soon as they started playing, he forgot about everything else. They played for hours, laughing and joking and strategizing. For the first time in weeks, he was able to relax. As the sun began to set, they put the game away, and Hardanger looked at Harold with gratitude in his eyes. It was clear that his brother had saved him from himself. Astrid smiled too, knowing that his wounds were finally starting to heal, both inside and out. Hardanger flexed his arm muscles, swinging the axe as he sliced through logs for the fire. He couldn't help but think about splitting Hedmark's head open with that same weapon, but much to his frustration, Hedmark was nowhere to be seen. Hardanger wasn't one to wait around for an attack that might never come. If Harold were open to it, he would have suggested they journey to Gudvangen together. But alas, Harold was always so obstinate. During his leisure time, Hardanger's mind wandered to thoughts of attacking Atle Knud and his sons. He pictured himself striking down not only Hedmark, but also Atle Knud. Hafnar Fjordur, on the other hand, could escape with his life. It was a shame that his plans always fell apart due to Harold's stubbornness. Finally, Hedmark arrived. It was fortunate that Harold had stationed guards on the roads. Hedmark did not come alone, however. He had carefully planned his attack, waiting until the brothers were perhaps less alert, and assembling a picked and numerous band. Hedmark had decided that one life was not enough to compensate for Hjorun Gavag. Both brothers had to die, with Hedmark himself striking the final blow. Hedmark had to carry out his plan without Hafnar Fjordur's help, but the latter did not obstruct it either. Hafnar Fjordur sought vengeance where he could and to the extent he was able, but he refused to join the attack against the Magnus brothers based on his sense of justice. Hedmark questioned whether Hafnar Fjordur's sense of justice also commanded him to leave his brothers unavenged should he also fall. Hafnar Fjordur said only time would tell, but that it was possible. "You seem to care more for Harold than your brothers," Hedmark said coldly. "I hold Harold in high regard," Hafnar Fjordur replied, "but you and your brother were not afraid to use your greater force to attack Hardanger." The conversation came to an end. Hedmark gathered enough men to guarantee a victory over the Magnus brothers, even if they were prepared. Under the cover of night, he set off towards Drammen, taking secret paths and hiding in the woods. He marched only at night, resting during the day. Despite his caution, Harold's guards received news of the expedition and informed Harold that Hedmark was approaching with a large force. The brothers quickly gathered an even larger force to march against him and meet him before he expected it. The battle took place in the winter on the heath, Hedmark and his men having camped on the outskirts of the woods the night before. The night was calm with mild air, and the ground was heavy. The weather was perfect for a battle, except that the hard-trodden snow became slippery. Hedmark and the Magnus brothers prepared for a trial of strength on their own sides in all quietness and at their leisure. The result of the battle was crucial, and they urged their men to be cautious and stay together. Hedmark seemed to be heading towards Hardanger, and Hardanger was not one to shy away from a willing opponent. It wasn't long before they stood opposite each other, both fiercely and vigilantly watching. However, their fight was short-lived. They had exchanged only a few blows, and neither of them had been wounded when Hedmark slipped on the smooth ground. In the same instant, Hardanger's axe came down on his neck, and Hedmark fell and remained lying there. Red blood poured profusely from a deep wound in his neck. Smoking, it oozed into the cold, white snow, forming holes with reddish edges, and thus Hedmark fell. After he fell, Harold had the trumpet blown for a truce and invited Hedmark's followers to leave in peace. With nobody desiring to fight any more, Hedmark's men carried his body and returned to Gudvangen after their unsuccessful attempt. Hardanger was overjoyed. He never remembered being so happy. Now he had avenged the attack at Hisargavel and settled all the rest of the score he had with Atle's sons. His mind was spinning with intoxication, and he composed and sang a victory song, his voice loud and strong. Harold's victory did not bring him any sense of triumph. Instead, he was lost in thought and quiet. When he and his men returned home, he immediately went to see his father and informed him of Hedmark's fall. Magnus listened carefully and then bellowed with his imposing voice, "The wounds of Hardanger's axe will not only be felt by Atle's sons. Trust me, our peace in Drammen is over. Even with our friends by our side, Atle Knud and Hafnar Fjordur's power will prove too great. Make peace with Hafnar Fjordur before it's too late. For the sake of our old friendship, he may just be satisfied with taking your property and driving you from this area. I know I am too old to leave Drammen, but don't worry about me. I'm full of days and will soon pass. I had a feeling that Hardanger would bring misfortune, but he's a brave man, and what's done is done. Bring him to me." Magnus had never before wanted to see Hardanger. In the past, Hardanger's mere presence had been a constant annoyance, but now Magnus wanted to see him. When Hardanger arrived, Magnus examined him with his red, inflamed, and swollen eyes. Hardanger's cheerful demeanor even compelled him to be friendly towards Magnus. "You don't look like a typical warrior," Magnus remarked, "but I will give you Astrid since she desires you. Take her and marry her quickly. I want to raise a glass to your marriage before I pass, which will be soon." Hardanger smiled, expressing gratitude, though he found the permission to marry Astrid somewhat unnecessary. He didn't want any trouble that day. Hedmark's defeat had left him feeling content and beneficent. Meanwhile, Harold had been thinking all day. By evening, he asked Hardanger to speak with him alone. "What if we sent messengers to Hafnar Fjordur, offering him an agreement on terms he sets himself?" Harold inquired softly. "Seems like it's a sign of weakness to just leave it up to Hafnar Fjordur's decision," replied Hardanger, arrogance dripping from his words. "If he wants to visit us, we'll show him how we receive guests." "You forget, brother," countered Harold, remaining calm yet troubled. "I can only use weapons against Hafnar Fjordur as a last resort. You've taken both of his brothers from him. Regardless of how it happened, it's a great loss for him. For my part, I'll gladly make peace with him at any price he agrees on." Harold's words struck Hardanger deeply. "If you're willing to submit to Hafnar Fjordur's decision, then I guess I can agree," he replied in a more compliant tone. "I haven't lost by letting you make decisions so far." Harold selected the best-suited men for the mission and sent them to Gudvangen to offer Hafnar Fjordur terms. Hafnar Fjordur received the envoys in silence and without returning their greetings, though they had been companions on a summer Viking expedition and some had been friends. They didn't recognize him with all signs of youthfulness erased from his face. Though his skin was still soft, deep furrows marked it, and his gaze was cold and solitary. When he learned of their mission, he replied icily, "I'll answer someday. In the meantime, you have food and shelter." They waited a week for Hafnar Fjordur's answer. He had to first battle with his father and then himself. Atle Knud wouldn't enter into any agreement, demanding unconditionally and without passion the lives of Magnus's brothers. He blamed Hafnar Fjordur for not following his advice and initiating blood brotherhood with Harold and Hardanger. Hafnar Fjordur was silent. It wasn't until Atle Knud agreed to leave the matter in Hafnar Fjordur's hands that he began to fight with himself. His family instinct demanded blood, not compensation. Even multiplied Weregeld couldn't make up for the loss of his brothers. But would the lives of Hardanger and Harold make a difference? The fact was nothing could compensate him for losing his brothers. Large fines could maintain the family's outward honor, but they couldn't bring justice to the situation. It was unthinkable to bear weapons against Harold, who had done nothing wrong. Hafnar Fjordur had made a vow to decide impartially if ever called upon to do so. After much contemplation, he called for Harold's messengers and delivered his judgment. The Magnus brothers would not receive compensation for Hjörungavag's unjustified attack on Hardanger. However, Hafnar Fjordur would take all of the Magnus brothers' real property as compensation for Hedmark's death. If they did not leave all their land, territory, fjords and hills within 3 winters, they would be treated as outlaws wherever they were found in the district. The messengers informed the Magnus brothers of Hafnar Fjordur's sentence. Harold accepted it calmly, while Hardanger was furious. He couldn't believe such an unreasonable sentence had been passed. Harold advised him to take the matter quietly, reminding him that Hafnar Fjordur had suffered a great loss. Hardanger's bitterness towards Hafnar Fjordur faded quickly as he became absorbed in the question of where they should go and settle. He considered England, Ireland, the Faroe Islands, Hjaltland, and the Southern Islands, but the idea of Iceland suddenly occurred to him. He was delighted with the idea and sought out Harold, shouting, "We will go to Iceland. There we shall have a whole country to ourselves." Harold asked if it wouldn't be somewhat lonely, smiling at his friend's enthusiasm. Hardanger pondered the idea and eventually admitted that it could lead to solitude in the long haul. "But we'll have followers, mark my words. Many Norwegians hold discontent towards Hellstorm, who refuses to tolerate anyone else's opinions. The best of our people will join us there, those who can no longer find freedom in this land. Hellstorm is already seeking to execute our finest men, but there his reach cannot extend. Sooner or later the land's fertility will entice settlers. Let us be the first. Harold, do you hear me? Let us be the first." There was a certain allure to Hardanger's plan that captivated Harold. If he had to leave and seek a new abode, why not start anew in an unexplored country? Harold, the unfazed, felt his heart race. Hardanger was filled with enthusiasm and, hence, impossible to deny. Eventually, Harold succumbed and said, "We can travel there during the summer and explore the land." Once Hardanger attained Harold's approval, he became ecstatic and exceedingly difficult to control. Harold had to wrestle him. There was no way around it. After a brief scuffle, they both collapsed onto the soft bed of snow. Once their tussle was over, they began covering one another with snow, until their laughter caused them to stop. The boys within them emerged, and they delved into a moment of pure happiness and bliss, forgetting all about their worries over losing their possessions. Lifeblood surged through their veins, rekindling memories of their past battles.